Hi guys, thanks for tuning into another episode of Nuggets News, our monthly housing and economy update with our friend Martin North coming to us live from the UK. How are you, Martin?
Yeah, very good. How you going?
Pretty good. It's been another crazy month of world news, and all obviously tying into Australia. I've been talking about how I feel like Australia's kind of the test bed for a lot of these global policies they're rolling out. But what are
Yeah.
your thoughts on everything happening?
Yes, I mean, it's been another crazy month, hasn't it? And a lot of it's around the tariffs. But there's broad other issues to talk about too. And I agree with you that there seem to be some pushing of the boundaries in Australia. And it'll be interesting to see how much of it actually sticks and how much people push back on. Of course, Australians tend to be down at the beach and are not too worried about this stuff. But when you stop and think about it, if you think about it in a holistic sense, there's a lot to worry about.
Yeah, I think cities in particular, Melbourne, I really think that could turn nasty in the next 3 years, and as we've sseen in some of the big cities across the UK and US.
Absolutely right. Well, thing is quite true that when people are under financial pressure and social pressure, society can actually fall apart quite quickly. And knowing how many people are really up against it at the moment and are pretty dischuffed with, the political system and how it's not really doing anything for them,
Yes.
well, it leads to some worrying outcomes sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into these slides of yours. So first up, the markets react to the art of the deal going full Picasso.
Yeah, that was a show I made over the weekend. Trump keeps coming up with these changes to tariffs. He pushed the target up and then withdrew it from from China, right, for a period of time. Then he turned the wick up on the EU, which is actually the next slide. This was what he said originally, but he's now backed off and said, "Well, no, we'll do something middle of July." And so the point to understand is the art of the deal is about distorting and changing reality to put the other person off. Right? That's what it's about. So we should not be surprised that he continues to shift left and right and change. This is part of how he thinks, but that's why I said it's more like Picasso rather than a real picture, right? It's warping and distorting reality.
Yeah, he's poking the bear almost and seeing how they react, and then going from there to try and cut deals or get America's way or bring change. And yeah, it's just crazy to watch it all play out.
Well, the question is there really an agenda that he's actually sticking to underneath, all of this sort of stupidity, or is it actually that they're feeling their way or what they're doing? I suspect there is actually some intent around what he's doing, but it's not necessarily that great for us, for Australia and other countries that are sort of connected through trade internationally. But I also question about what's it doing to the American scene as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is Trump's big, beautiful tax and spending bill trying to help, I guess, the household pockets of a lot of people, but going to cost a lot in US debt.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The big, beautiful bill, it passed one house. It's now going to the Senate for review. It's interesting that the question is who are the winners and who are the losers. There are some things that sort of make a nod to some people who are in the lower income quintiles. But actually, if you look carefully, most of it actually is in support of those further up the income scales. And it's interesting that the estimates. Well, it varies a little bit, but people are saying that this is another 3.9 to 4 trillion US locking in terms of more debt, and we'll come on to that in a second. But it's interesting that Trump's spokespeople are saying, no, it's going to save us money. So there is a fundamental flaw in, is it a win, is it a lose? But we know that there are going to be some winners and some losers. I'm not sure that ordinary Australians are going to be winners, though.
Yes. Okay. So next up, the bond market's been fascinating to watch. We covered this in a recent episode as well, particularly with everything going on in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is now getting into the debt's ticking up, right? 36 trillion and rising. That's more than $106,000 US per person in America. But of course, the debt's going up, as you can see there on the bottom right, but the bond markets are not happy. And what's interesting about the bond markets is, to an extent, they are a bit of a check and a balance between, the political sphere and the economic sphere. Now, whether you believe in the bond vigilantes as an entity, or whether it's actually a group of powerful people who actually are working in the bond market for their own interests, the truth is that they are protesting. And they are protesting specifically by the fact that long bonds, in other words, long end of the yield curve, are way higher than they were. And just to give you a little bit of context for that, it's worth making the point. 38% of US Treasury debt needs to be matured over the next couple of years, right? 38%. So there's a lot of new money required. And the problem is, if those long-term bond yields stay high, it means that government debt is going to be high, but the interest on that debt is going to be high too. And that's going to mean that more public funds need to effectively fund that higher debt. So this is a big deal. And the point on the next slide is to say this isn't just now happening in the US, but the bond vigilantes are effectively pushing up yields. Look at Germany, look at Japan, look at the US Treasury. And the fact is, Japan is probably one of the most exposed relative to other countries, and that's quite interesting. And in fact, you can quickly have a quick look down with the US 30-year, above 5. You've got the UK 30-year well above 5. You've got the Japanese 30-year above 3, which is amazing. And the next slide just shows you how much Japan is driving the duration crash. Remember that bond prices and yields go in opposite directions. So bond prices are falling as yields are rising. In other words, people want higher interest rate to cover the higher risk. So this is very, very important to understand. And I think this is a non-functioning market. So for me, this signals a risk, a really big risk, and we're almost in 2007 territory here.
Yeah, we saw that some of those bond auctions weren't getting any bids, and as you say, it's a whole different kettle of fish trying to refinance. I think it's around $8 trillion of the US in the next couple of years at 0% where they've been versus at 5%, and we know the US is struggling to even pay the interest payments on that debt. So the other thing I suppose spoke about in my episode was that the US dollar has always been the traditional safe haven, but now that the debt's so far out of hand, people are going, well, do we trust the government? And then you said the political tensions, if China are no longer liking what America does and they're big bondholders. So you've got all these things in play where people are just finally waking up to what people like you and I and heaps of others have been talking about for a long time, that fiat money and the bond market and all that is just backed by nothing but confidence in government, which people are finally realizing the government doesn't have their best interests at heart and probably is never going to pay off this debt.
Well, fiat means, it's all about faith and trust. And of course, if you look at the next slide there, I've put the US dollar index, which is back down again below 100, which is significant. So the depreciation of the US dollar. But on the other hand, the stock markets are up and down like a yo-yo, and the volatility has been a lot higher. So depending on when you bought and how you think about those markets, they look quite wobbly. And remember that the PE ratio in the US on the S&P 500 is 21, which is dramatically high. It's higher than it probably warrants given everything we know, because you would expect with the tariffs and with everything else and the exchange rate changes, you would expect companies in the US not to be earning so strongly. And the PE of 21 is priced for perfection. And I don't think the markets are actually priced for perfection adequately and appropriately. So we've got equities way overvalued. We've got exchange rates moving significantly. We've got bond markets not believing the future is necessarily strong in the US and actually looking to move out of the US. And that's one of the reasons why these bond yields are so high. And it's interesting, there's a little meme I saw, which I thought was quite good. There's a hole in the floor. It's always been there, don't panic. We've won the race with it. There are other boats in worse shape. And of course, that's the point, right? So the US economy might be the least dirty shirt up until now. But now, if you look carefully, they've got precisely the same issues. Too much debt, all of those things, as many other economies have too. And so the question is, how is this all going to play out? And what are the implications for ordinary people? Because frankly, if governments around the world continue to issue yet more debt, as we've said many times, it continues to put pressure on ordinary people. They need to get more tax taken. We'll talk about that in a second. And of course, the result is, well, people are looking for alternatives. So gold, of course, has been quite strong, not quite on its highs at the moment, but as a source of safety. It's interesting that when the stock markets crashed, gold then shot up. when stock markets start to recover because Trump said that the tariffs were going to be not quite as aggressive, then they came back the other way. And by the way, just to quickly on the tariffs, interesting that the UK is the only economy that I know of who's actually put in a trade agreement in with the US, but they've basically walked into a trap and they're now paying 10% tariffs that they weren't before. So, and yet somehow claiming it as a victory. I don't know how that works. So you can see just how stupid the whole thing is. So gold, obviously a source of prospective value, and of course we should touch on Bitcoin. Bitcoin knocking around 109 plus or minus. It moves up and down a bit, but it is interesting, really interesting that Bitcoin is back in vogue too. Again, because people don't trust the financial system.
Yeah, and on that Bitcoin scarcity thing, I think more and more people kind of understand that now, that relative to fiat currencies, Bitcoin is finite. But this applies to stock markets as well. And we've spoken about this a bit over the past couple of years now, is that, yes, there's a sort of crash coming in terms of living standards and all that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that the stock market and all these assets like housing, if they're relatively finite and scarce compared to all this money that's been printed, PE ratios and all the fundamentals for traditional valuations kind of go out the window. And they might be trying to hyper inflate away all this debt. Even the strategic reserve could be a play to try and pump Bitcoin to the moon if the American government and BlackRock and all that own a lot of Bitcoin, as a way to sort of do this debt jubilee and say, let's get rid of this debt now, we've got a heap of Bitcoin. So there's all these sort of mechanics at work that haven't really been in play in previous generations for market investors and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and of course the Trump family is very active in the crypto community, right? I think that they're creating a new fund to invest another $3 billion into I think mostly Bitcoin, but maybe other cryptos too, and they got their own meme coins as well. So there is something fundamentally different this time around. And just on the different this time around, I want just to sort of segue across to Australia, because there was also a very important court case in Victoria, right? And this is fascinating. So the court case in Victoria suggests that Bitcoin should be thought of as money, not an investment asset. Now, if that's true, then boy, that changes the game, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I was actually involved back in 2017 with trying to help the Australian government construct their crypto tax framework policy. And I was trying to explain to them where this is heading, and they were trying to treat it like these traditional assets. And I was trying to explain that we're going to have this whole world of Ethereum and DeFi and gaming and all these other assets, and you have to start thinking about it differently, and that Bitcoin was money. And obviously it sort of all went over the head for the most part. But here we are with this court case, and I think there'll be a lot of happy investors and long-term holders if they're learning that they might not have to pay tax on their crypto.
Yeah, well, the appeal depends, I guess, on what happens from this point. But it's interesting. If in fact it's a currency rather than an investment, then as you say, you don't have to pay tax on the gains you make. That would change the game dramatically. I wouldn't be surprised to see some of the other ATO, etc., pushing back a little bit on this. But it's a fascinating development. And again, going back to is this a lab experiment? If it happens here in Australia, is that going to happen elsewhere too? So it really is fascinating.
Cool. Okay. Next up, so we did get a final rate cut here, Martin. Finally.
Second cut, of course, and interestingly, the statement on monetary policy that came out at the same time from the RBA had uncertain more than 130 times through the document. So they were saying, we don't know, right? They run multiple scenarios. There's scenarios where maybe the trade stuff isn't too bad. There are other scenarios where the trade stuff is significantly impactful on the Australian economy indirectly, and they reference China particularly. But they are still expecting now inflation to begin to still stay within band for longer. So they sort of left the door open for more rate cuts through the year. The markets went full, we're going to get another 4 or 5 over the year. I suspect that might be overdone. But people are now expecting rates to come down. But then the inflationary spikes that we're seeing may come back. We had an announcement about energy costs. We'll touch on that later. We also know that food prices are still rising quite fast, particularly fresh foods. So, it's not a one-way street here. And interestingly, if you look at the next one, the monetary policy, as Shane Oliver said, is somewhat less restrictive, but the cash rate is still above the average of the RBA's estimates of neutral. In other words, this doesn't take away from momentum in the economy. And so they are expecting more cuts, the next cut perhaps in August. Fascinating to see how this plays out. But against this backcloth of uncertainty, as I said in my show, expect the unexpected, because uncertainty is spiraling higher.
Yeah, so households have been waiting for these cuts and, as you say, thinking that maybe we're going to get more now. But in that environment of overseas markets with bond rates over 5% and that type of thing, we can't have this situation, even if we wanted to, that Australia would have rates down at 2.5% if they're sitting at 5% in these other countries we're so tightly linked with as well. So people have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and the long-term bonds in Australia are also a little higher than they had been previously, which again crimps people's style in terms of being able to take rates lower. Now, the implication, of course, well, households on the next slide, as I've shown before, the home prices versus capacity to pay have really fallen apart in recent years. This is one of the reasons why my surveys are so important in terms of showing that a lot of households are actually in difficulty. Now, of course, if in fact rates were to come down, capacity to pay would increase because effectively the buffer rate drops, and that means that people can borrow more. But then house prices, of course, will chase higher as well. So you actually could well end up with affordability being no better, in fact, potentially worse. And on affordability, if you look at the next slide, this is the Demographic International Housing Affordability Report, which came out very recently. And guess what? Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, all in the top 15 least affordable housing markets around the world. Now, you can argue about the methodology, right? And there are some people who doesn't think it's great. But I think that comparing average incomes with average prices in the main centres makes some sense. And we know things are badly out of kilter. And so capacity to pay in median house prices means housing affordability still shot. And frankly, rate cuts won't necessarily change the game.
And this all ties into the unrealised gain stuff that we're going to get to in a second as well, I think.
Funnily enough, it does. It's interesting that CoreLogic on the next slide said, don't expect a boom in housing prices until affordability improves. And if you look at all the numbers, with potentially the house price moves up, that doesn't actually increase the capacity to borrow relative to what you had previously because you're chasing higher house prices. And in fact, if you look at the next one, you can see there that people are saying that, there could well be a bit of a pickup. Louis Christophers thinks the auction clearance rates and volumes probably signals some momentum up. And there are various people calling, 5 to 8 to 15% price rises in the next year or two. But I have to say, you've got to be really careful with these numbers. Not all markets are behaving the same. Houses and units are not behaving the same. And there are still areas where prices are still falling. So again, don't get too caught up with this high-level hype. But everything's going up, mate. Buy now. That's the real estate story. But there's another story about affordability which we just can't walk away from.
Yeah. And next up here, you've got the reality versus the statisticians.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's been quite a lot of news about how wages growth have really taken off. And, everybody's now feeling much more affluent than previously. And in fact, there were a couple of releases from the ABS that really, I think, were almost misleading in the way that they presented the data. So I made a show called Reality versus the Statisticians. Yes, you do have a real income recession. So if you actually take incomes and income growth and actually adjust it for inflation, as the macro business slide shows you, we're actually going backwards, right? We were higher in 2021 because of all the government handouts, but growth rates are now low. And in fact, worryingly, if you project it forward using the RBA data in that statement on monetary policy, it's going to be another 10 years before we're back to where we were. So in real terms, real incomes for real households are continuing to go backwards. And that's a major issue for a lot of households. That's one of the reasons why, again, I see it in my surveys. A lot of households are struggling. So I don't understand, the government's saying incomes are going up and, the election campaign was all about, well, we've made real incomes grow. Yes, but no, you haven't. No, you've made incomes at the top level perhaps grow a little bit, but when you actually adjust for inflation, your purchasing power, you continue to go backwards. And that's the problem. And that's what happens with fiat. Because basically what it means is the value of your dollar is continuing to get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And that's the problem.
I think people have to understand that compared to these other countries as well, the Five Eyes and the countries in the West, if Australia is this test bed where we actually don't have that high level of government debt and the average Aussies have been feeling pretty wealthy because of their property prices, if they do want to bring in these new measures to get more control and all that sort of thing, which they seem to be really hell bent on, we're going to start to see these dramatic policy changes, which is what we're starting to see, to strip you of your assets of this own nothing and being happy that they were trying to push us towards.
Yeah. So let's face it, on the next slide, Christopher Joy writes there that high public spending has secured the soft landing. So government spending as a proportion of the total economy, as we'll see in a slide or two, it has never been higher. So we are totally reliant on government spending, and that includes government-created jobs, as we discussed previously, and also the handouts, electricity support, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the government still needs to find more tax, because they cannot square the books at the moment. So the forward budget it's going to be in deficit. So they're looking for new tax plays. Not surprised, but what they've really settled on this is now on this idea of, rather than looking at grabbing gains when you buy or sell assets and create a gain or a loss, what they're planning potentially to do, and they're using the superannuation pool of over 3 million as the target initially, to tax unrealized gains. So each year, effectively, if you've got superannuation assets over 3 million, the change in the value of those assets over the year will be calculated, and a proportion of that will be taxed. So whether you've sold your assets or not, or whether you hold the asset, effectively you'll start to have to pay extra tax. Now that's a real worrying shift in philosophy about how tax works, because tax in the past has actually been created on the back of transactions that creates value that you can then pay the tax on. But if you think about it, if you're holding property and property values go up 5 to 10% a year, and they calculate you owe the tax man some amount of money on the back of that, how are you going to pay that tax if all you've got is a property, right, in your superannuation fund? Just an example, right? And now, my argument is this is a bad bill. And in fact, my post, the next incoming tax grab, taxing unrealized gains, that I put up a couple of months ago, that's one of my best shows this year. It's got more than 70,000 views at the moment. And people are really concerned about this, and they should be, because on the next slide, you can see there that, Robert Goplinson said the other day, the unrealized gains tax has been carefully designed by Treasury so that it can be extended to all investment assets and maybe one day to the family home. So that's the sort of the first point to take. So you might think it's 3 million and it's never going to touch me. That 3 million, by the way, is not inflation adjusted over the year. So effectively the tax will bite harder and harder. Means more people, if they're saving in their superannuation in 20 years, 30 years time, could have 3 million in their superannuation. But the other point is this is opening a crack that allows the tax system to grab other assets. Not just in superannuation potentially, but what about the family home? And that's exactly what they're worrying about. They're coming after your home, is the headline there. And interestingly, though, in the midst of that, there is an appalling gap. There's one group which is exempt from this. So one group gets exempt from the new superannuation tax. Guess who they are? Oh, politicians. Yeah. Politicians and the PM and all those senior people and a few other hangers-on won't need to pay this unrealized tax gain until they retire. So they don't need to have the cash flow each year to pay. It's remarkable. So not only are they opening the door on this unrealized tax rubbish, but they continue to carve out a nice safe haven for the politicians and the hangers-on. It's absolutely disgraceful.
Well, if that doesn't show you that they care about themselves more than the average Aussie, like nothing does exempting themselves. But when we also put that in, think about how many people now work for the government and the numbers that are increasing, or how many people are now on the NDIS. It's just this two-tier system they're trying to create. And $3 million, people might say, oh, that sounds okay for the rich or whatever. But if they cared about the rich, they'd be taxing these big corporates that pay no tax and the ultra wealthy. This is about carving out the upper middle class and trying to create this two-tier society where you've got the rich and then the government, and everyone else is kind of in this lower class, and that takes away your freedoms and that type of thing. And as you say, extended to other assets, bracket creep if they keep pushing property up, but they can also turn around next year and go, oh, we're going to reduce it to 2 million and then 1 million.
Yeah, well,
So
the Greens wanted to drop it to 2 million already. So, there's some horse trading there. The other interesting point, Alex, if you look at it in the context of the government debt and what have you, on the next slide, you can see there that the Australian government sector as a share of the economy has never been higher. It's 28% of GDP, remarkably high. That's one of the reasons why we've got so much issues, right? And the other one, look at Victoria. Victoria is the basket case, right? The net debt in billions of dollars is rising. It's 167.6 billion, looking to grow to 194 billion. I mean, how are they going to service this debt? Remember the bond issue conversation we had? It's nuts. So we have this real issue where government's spending like there's no tomorrow. A lot of people want the government to spend big, but then there's a consequence, and the consequences are you have to pay more tax, and you'll own nothing. Is becoming more and more true. You're renting everything. You just having to continue to pay and pay and pay and pay. And like I said, if you've got illiquid assets, and you're asked every year to pay an additional tax bill, how are you going to pay that bill without disposing of the assets?
And the flow-on effects of, as you say, more and more is just public sector working for the government or people living off government money. So the proportion of people that are actually working and paying tax to fund that, it just mathematically doesn't work out. But then what's the incentives to start a business? If you can go and walk someone's dog and look after someone for $70 an hour on the NDIS, as we've spoken about in previous episodes, why is there any entrepreneurial spirit? Who's going to take a risk and start a small business where it costs so much to get started, blah, blah, blah? It's like I said, it just feels like it's all designed in Australia as a test bed to see how poorly you can run an economy and how quickly they can usher in this Agenda 2030 stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're going to end up, with effectively a very basic level of income, and that'll be it. Anything above that, they're going to, tax you blind. And it's not productive. It's not actually laying a positive foundation for people or for businesses, but it's creating a bigger ever government sector that's actually more and more in control. And, then we link into things like, central bank digital currencies and digital this and digital that and control and everything else. It just becomes more and more. And so we got to push back against this. And so for me, this unrealized tax story is a really important campaigning issue. And it's interesting how the media's picked it up now. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. I suspect that the Labor government, who's come back with this massive majority and, the other side of politics falling apart as we speak, will feel empowered to do some of these things. But it's not good, it's not right, and it's not fair.
Absolutely. But moving on. So no cash, crickets, and a war of mass distraction.
So, a year ago, we had the Regional Banking Inquiry report that basically said the government needed to seriously consider making sure that cash was available in the bush, that banking services was available in the regions. And they had 90 days a year ago to come back with a response. Guess what? The government never came back with a response, right? So there's no change on cash. We've still got branches closing left, right, and centre. ATMs being ripped out. We just got crickets, nothing at all. But we've had a war of mass distraction, right? We've had, The Voice, and we've had the election, and we've had lots of other stuff going on, housing policy. But this issue hasn't gone away. So I'm calling now Daniel Molino, who's now the new Assistant Treasurer and the person in charge of financial services, to come clean on what they're going to do, because this is a really important issue. That report, which took over a year to do, and they had lots of visits to the regions and showed just how badly the banks were behaving, needs a response. And their recommendations about, a postal bank or a national bank or, a levy on banks to support banking in the regions hasn't gone away. And by the way, cash in a time of crisis, like in the floods, when the electricity goes off, you need cash. So, this is a really critical issue. And again, the government's let us down.
Well, I'm sure that's why that is silence, Martin, because everything they found out probably showed how important cash is with everything happening in all these times that ATMs go down or FPOS goes down, all that type of thing. So yeah,
absolutely. And on that, just a quick nod to the floods in northern New South Wales in particular, and our thoughts go to those who are caught up in them. About 50,000 people, are in some way impacted. Claims around 3,000 insurance claims at the moment, but perhaps 10,000 in total, significantly absolutely impacted. It's a long road. Chris Min says no will be left behind, but I'm already seeing people being left behind. And if you want a couple of examples of that, firstly, on the next slide, there's a warning that more homes won't be insured, can't be insured. We already see a lot of people in flood-prone areas who can't get insurance at the moment. We also know that dairy prices are likely to rise, milk prices in particular, because of the fact that you've got a bunch of issues there. So there are massive consequences again, and I'm afraid that there's a lip service and a gap between what people say they're going to do and what's actually happening on the ground. A lot of people will have significant financial pressures on the back of this as well. And the bottom line is it's a long, hard road to the cleanup. But, how many times do we get these floods now? 1 in 100-year floods every year or two?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what your thoughts on that are, Martin, but I've covered it in different episodes. We've now got 30 US states which have banned weather modification that people used to think was a crazy conspiracy. So people are waking up to this stuff. And as you say, it seems to always happen in these specific areas and regions. I don't know if you saw Dr. John Campbell do a good episode about how the UK's approved those experiments to block out the sun. They're looking to do that in Australia as well. And I've covered this in my show about how it seems to be targeting a lot of farmland as well. This all ties into beef and dairy and this type of thing. So it's just crazy to watch all this continue to play out. We have to wake people up to all this stuff that's happening.
And interestingly, New Zealand has just pulled away from net zero. Did you see that?
Yeah.
So fascinating. So much to sort of talk about. Just two other quick points before we close out. Firstly, just to highlight the fact that electricity prices are going up again, right? So in 36 days, we're going to see prices rise on average around 10% for people in New South Wales and Queensland and South Australia too. The energy system is still broken. The energy system driven off gas, which is still very highly priced. We're still paying through the nose for that. The government doesn't want to do anything about it. They're blaming poles and wire, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a massive failure of energy policy. They could and should be getting income from the gas rather than actually paying money to the gas companies to export gas offshore and then have to buy it back at massive prices. So again, everybody should understand energy prices are deliberately higher than they should be.
80% of our natural resources now owned by foreign corporations, I think was the stat I read. And as I said, if you want to make the case for Australia being the test bed for how to sell out a country to the globalists to do what you want, it's just looking more and more like it's a sad future ahead the next few years unless something changes.
And the last one, which is just a quick headline, the ACCC is now probing the REA Group over price gouging concerns, which I thought was really interesting, right? So that's literally announced today. So I've always said for a long, long time that these property portals are actually pulling a fast one left, right and centre, and the information on those portals aren't necessarily the true story always. So this is a really interesting event too. So my summary is we pull back. You can't trust governments. You can't necessarily trust some of the information on some of the portals, right? Maybe there's price gouging going on. So who do you trust? The answer is you've got to actually trust yourselves and trust your own thoughts about what's going on. So don't just, take the big picture and say, well, they must be looking after us and they must be doing the things for us. No, actually, you need to be asking some really hard questions. And we've been doing this show, since 2018? And in a way, whilst the thematics might shift a little bit, the fundamental story is you cannot trust the government to look after you. You cannot trust big corporations to look after you. You need to take ownership yourself.
100%. Become a sovereign citizen. And if you're in one of the big cities and you see this happening around you in slow motion, start to make a plan to build a new life and move somewhere else or whatever. But just don't be one of the people that does nothing until it's too late if we continue down this path. So one of our best shows in a while, I reckon. Martin, really enjoyed that. All the links to follow Martin's work down below as always, guys. And we'll talk to you again next month, Martin. Cheers.
Take care. See you.